Pedra is Vayeira, but I would like to just much shortly before just a couple minutes ago, I received a call that a certain person who lived in Lincolnwood, Dennis Medorsky, he passed away, and Dennis was a person who regularly, he not only listened to the shir every week, but he looked forward every week to hearing the shir. And it was a very fine person, and he really had no family, and so I feel a special obligation because he was sort of part of the family. All those that are involved in the shir here, he was part of our family. So I would just like to dedicate the shir today in Dennis's memory. All right, now in Parshas Vayeira, so at the conclusion of Parshas Vayeira, it talks about the Akedah, when Avraham received the command from God, that the way Avraham understood the command was for him to place his son on the Mizbeach, on the altar, and to sacrifice his son to God. This is considered one of the 10 tests. Some say it was most of the commentaries say it was the 10th test. Others say it was the 9th test that Avraham had. But to put his son on the altar, from the Midrashim, it seems that God said, it was never my intention for you to actually slaughter Yiztchak on the altar. Lo amarti lecha shachtehu, I did not tell you to slaughter him, ela ha'alehu, to put him on the altar. In other words, the command that God intended was for Yitzchak to be a living sacrifice, a living gift to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he had to, not that Yitzchak should die, chas v'shalom, but that Yitzchak's whole life should be one of dedication, of being dedicated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Anyway, but Avraham, and of course that was part of the test, Avraham did not understand the original command, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu manipulated that he shouldn't understand. It was to demonstrate perhaps to the nations of the world, because at that time, the nations of the world, to their idolatry, they used to sacrifice their son. And there were probably those who felt that Avraham is not as dedicated to his God as they were to their idols. So consequently, that the world should recognize Avraham's dedication to God. It was necessary for Avraham to think that the command was a command to actually sacrifice or to put him on the altar, which would necessitate his being sacrificed to God. But in fact, it was just the idea, focusing on the idea that the true sacrifice, the true commitment, the true gift to God is God dedicating one's life to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think, but the Torah tells us that the command was given at Avraham it was at night, and it was like a prophetic vision through a dream, in which Kachas Binchas Yechidcha She'ahavta V'Halehu La'ola should make him a sacrifice on the altar, put him on the altar, and Avraham it was told to go to Eretz HaMoriah, to the land of Moriah. Moriah, according to our sages, that's Jerusalem. V'halei Sham alachar haharim, and on one of the mountains in the area there, but to the mountain that I will show, that I, God, will show you. And so Avraham and Yiztchak go traverse the land to Moriah over a period of 3 days. And it was on the third day, and Vayeira hamakom merachok, Avraham sees the place on top of the mountain from afar. And then so he turns to Narav. He turns because together with Avraham and Yitzchak, 2 servants of Avraham went. One clearly was Eliezer, according to some Midrashim. The other one was Yishmael, the son of a shivcha, the son of a maidservant. And he turns to them and he says, Shulachem poem achamor, you stay here with the donkey. V'ani v'hanar nelchat ko, me and the lad. V'nishtachava, and we will bow down to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'nashuva aleichem, and we will return to you. And the very interesting, the Daskenu Baal Tosfos cites the Medrash. The way that the Daskenu Baal Tosfos cites the Medrash is somewhat different than the way we have the Medrash. Whether he had a different text of the Medrash or he was just rephrasing it, I don't know. But I'm assuming that he had a different text or another Medrash. And the text is of the Medrash. Vayehi bayom hashlishi, it was on the third day, and Avraham sees the place from afar. Vayeira hamakom merachok, he sees the place from afar, and he says to his servants, "Shvulachem poem achamor, stay here with the donkey." So the Daskenu Baal Tosfos says, Medrash, Kishara Avram es hamakom merachok, when Avram saw the place from afar, v'anan kosher alav, and there was a heavenly cloud attached to it. Amar li Yitzchak beno, he said to Yitzchak his son, Ma taroeh, what do you see? Amar lo, Yitzchak said, Har noah ani roeh, I see a beautiful mountain, v'anan kosher alav, and there is a heavenly cloud attached to it, similar as some of the Parshas point out to the heavenly cloud that was over Mount Sinai at the time of Matan Torah. Chazar eitzel narav. So he then turned to his servants, the 2 servants that accompanied him on the road. V'amar lahem, and he said to them, Ma atem roem, what do you see? Amru lo, ein anu roem shum davar. They said, we didn't see anything. Amar lahem, atem v'hachamor shavim, you and the donkey are the same. She'einchem roem kamohu, just as he doesn't see anything, you don't see anything. Im kain, therefore, shvu lechem po im achamor, stay here with the donkey. And then the Daskenu Baal Tosfos adds something. Venerally, the Hainu Hach Dambarazal. This is this thing that our sages said. Am Hadome. The servants or the slaves who accompanied Avraham, they are like a nation that is similar to the chamor, to the donkey, Ulefichach eved ein lo chayis kechamor, and therefore a slave, legally does not have pedigree, or the halachic nature of his family life is limited. And we have to understand, it's not just a question of what the halacha is. Those were the facts of life that existed at that time. Because at that time, and for many years afterwards, slaves could be sold. They could be sold away from their spouse. They could be sold away from their children. Their children could be sold away from them. So in a sense, there wasn't a real attachment that other people had. And that was the servile perspective. So it seems very strange. We have this incident that the Medrash tells us that the servants did not see anything special, whereas Avraham saw an anon, a heavenly cloud, and Yiztchak saw, in his words, a mountain, a beautiful mountain, Har Noah, for anon kosher aleha, and a heavenly cloud attached to it, and the halacha that servants and servants or slaves have their legally their pedigree, the law of pedigree and the law of family is somewhat limited in their lives. So the question is, how are we to understand? How are we to understand this halacha? What is the connection between this incident and the law that the servants do not have pedigree with their children or with their parents? And what is, and on the other hand, when you take a look as to the way the Das Kenim Baal Tosfos quotes the Medrash, and our Medrash is somewhat different, it seems that Avraham, his primary focus was on the heavenly cloud. Medrash says he saw a heavenly cloud. Mara! What did he see? He saw a heavenly cloud. It doesn't say that he saw a beautiful mountain. He knew that the sacrifice was going to take place on a mountain. But there seems to be no focus on the fact that it was a beautiful mountain. Whereas when it comes to Yiztchak, and Avraham asked Yiztchak, what do you see? Isaac's replied, I see a beautiful mountain, va'anan kosher aleha, and a heavenly cloud attached to it. So if we assume that the Das Kenim Baal Tosfos had a different text in the Medrash, or had access to a different Medrash, we have to understand why there was a difference in the Medrash telling us what Avraham saw, focusing on what Avraham saw, and the Medrash when it focused on what Yiztchak saw. Now, the Medrash Rabbah and the Medrash Tanchuma that we have seem to imply that Avraham and Yiztchak saw the exact same thing. But from the Das Kenim Baal Tosfos, the simple reading of it does not seem to indicate that way. And as far as the Shnei Na'arav, the two servants, when Avraham turned to them and said, what do you see? So the Shnei Na'arim, the two servants said, we don't see anything. Now we can understand to some degree, but we'll explain why. That they didn't understand the Onan Kosher because they did not have that spiritual vision that Avraham and Yiztchak had. But Yiztchak said that he saw a Har Noah. He saw a beautiful mountain. So why weren't the servants able to see the beautiful mountain? Why didn't the beautiful mountain make an impression on them like it made an impression on Yiztchak? And what is interesting is the Medrash Tanchuma. Again, the Medrash Tanchuma is somewhat different than the way the Medrash Rabbi is, and the way the Medrash is mentioned in Das Kenim al Tosfos. Instead of saying we didn't see anything, they said we saw only desert. So we have to understand why there's different visions. The vision of Avraham, the vision of Yitzchak, and the vision of the vision and the vision of the Shnei Na'arav, of the two servants who accompanied Avraham. Now I think that there is a difference between the perspective of Avraham and Yitzchak in terms of their sense of closeness to God. Both Avraham and Yitzchak are institute philos, daven. Avraham instituted Shacharis, and that's in this week's Sedra. Vayakam Avraham got up in the morning at the time that Stone was being destroyed. El Hamakom Asher Amad Sham Berishona, to the place. And Makom, by the way, can have reference also to God, because God is called Makom. So, Hu Makomo Shalolam. So, Avraham instituted Tefillah Shacharis, and many times we see from the Gemara in Yuma that Avraham even davened mincha. He didn't institute mincha, but he davened mincha. And we see Avraham, God and Avraham conversing time and time again. Vayeira love Hashem, but it's not just one time. It's constant. In Yitzchak, of course, God appears to Yitzchak from time to time, but it's not, when we take a look at the Torah, it's not as often that God appeared to Yitzchak. And when Yitzchak goes to daven, the Torah tells us, where does Yitzchak go to daven? Yitzchak goes to daven. Vayetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sadeh. Yitzchak goes to daven in the fields, whereas Avraham has a special place. Now, Yitzchak might have had a special place also, but it seems that there is an emphasis in the Torah that Avram's, if he did have a special place, he went basada, he went to the fields to daven. And the question is, why did he go to the fields? It's interesting that in the time that it seems there were periods of time when the Jewish people in later generations also would daven in the fields. As a matter of fact, that's the reason some say that we say Baruch Hashem La'olam Amen V'Amen, because we don't want to leave the latecomers out alone after the finishing of davening. But whatever it is, there seems to be a difference between Avraham and Yitzchak. Yitzchak, when he goes to daven, he goes basada. He goes into the fields. And the question is, why did Yitzchak go to the fields? And I think the answer is very simple. Yitzchak perception of God was God in nature. Matter of fact, we see in Parshas Toldos, I've mentioned it before, that Yitzchak was ready to give the brachos to Esau. And the question is, Yitzchak, how is it that Yitzchak didn't realize who Esau was? But Torah tells us Esau was an ish sadeh. He was a man of the fields. I think perhaps Yitzchak made a mistake. And Yitzchak identified Esau with himself. And sometimes there is a tendency for a father to identify with his child, especially with the oldest child. So, by Yitzchak assumed that why did Esau go out into the field? Why was he in his sadeh? Because he felt closest to God there, just as he, Yitzchak, felt closest to God in the sadeh. That's why Yitzchak went to the sadeh to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when he davened, when he prayed. He went out to the fields. But Avraham had a somewhat of a different approach. We get first of all, it's well known. I mean, there is some discussion what it means, but Avraham, in the earliest part of his life, while he was searching, and initially it appears initially our ancestors. Now there is some discussion among the Mefarshim and the Haggadah whether Abbaseinu has reference to Terach, as the next sentence seems to suggest, or it has reference to Avraham, who was trained by Terach initially as a youngster. Terach is, but in any case, certainly, Avraham initially, even though he began searching at the age of 3, according to one medrash, and that seems to be the shita that the Rabbi is inclined to, whereas the Rambam talks about Avraham, Hikeres Boro, recognizing God at the age of 40. But whatever it is, initially Avraham did not fully recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there are all kinds of midrashim that at one point he davened to the sun. I shouldn't say davened. He served the sun, S-U-N, and then at night he said, there is no sun here. And then he served the moon, and the day he said, there is no moon here. And he came to recognize that the different forces of nature, the individual forces of nature themselves, were not gods. And the Medrash tells us also that when he finally recognized that there was a creator, but he began to think, because he looked at the world as many people do, and they see things that they don't understand taking place. They see catastrophe. And they say, God couldn't have done this, couldn't have allowed this. So he began to think that perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu, yes, God, there was a God who created the world, but he is no longer part of the world. So he recognized the God, but God was not in the world initially. And then God made himself known to Avraham. So Avraham's initial perception of the world and his perception of God was God as the creator, but not God as part of the world. And consequently, his main relationship with God was extraneous to nature. God was the controller of the world. God gave the world the ability to continue to exist. It was the koach havaya. But his closeness to God manifests itself in God appearing to him, or in him trying to communicate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the means of tefillah, through the means of prayer. Whereas Yiztchak, from the moment of his birth, and perhaps even earlier than that, he recognized HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world. And consequently, his main relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu was God nature, God within the nature. And that's why, Yiztchak l'suach b'sada, that's why Yitzchak went out into the field. When Avraham beheld the Anan, when he beheld the heavenly cloud, the mountain was not important, because when he saw God, primarily it was not nature. It was God. It didn't stand out in his mind. But Yitzchak, whose relationship with Avraham, whose relationship with God was within nature. So with him, he saw Har Noah ba'anan kasher lecha. He saw the beautiful mountain, and there was a heavenly cloud on it. Now, the halacha is so Avraham, and this is the idea also when the Medrash says that Avraham is compared to someone who saw a bira. He saw a building, and he said, and there was a fire. This way some explain it. And he said, perhaps the Baal Habira, he thought the Baal Habira had left the building, the mansion. But so HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Ani Baal Habira, I am the Baal Habira. But his initial perception was of a bira independent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God. And it's very interesting. Also, Yitzchak was a carbon, and as I mentioned, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intention, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intention, as the Medrash tells us, was never that Yitzchak should be slaughtered. But as Reb Chaim explains it, Yitzchak was a living carbon. He was a living sacrifice. I guess the word sacrifice is not a good word to use in this case, because sacrifice implies the loss of life. But he was someone that was given over to, he had the status of a living sacrifice, a korban before it was killed, but it was ongoing for the rest of his life. And in a sense, because of that, then we know that a sacrifice cannot taken out of the Beis Hamikdash, out of Yerushalayim, out of Jerusalem, or out of the temple. So in a sense, to Yitzchak, wherever Yitzchak went, to a certain degree, that was part of the temple. I mentioned in Parshas Noach that by Noach, the whole world was the temple of God. The whole world was created to be a place where man and God will have a meeting. And that's why after the Churban, after destruction of the world through the flood, so Noach gave korbanos, gave sacrifices, because the giving of sacrifices, Vayeira Hashem es reach hanichoach, God figuratively smelling the sweet smell of the sacrifices, is indicative of the fact that destruction of the temple is over, is no longer there. As we say in the Tochacha, we say, when the temple is in a state of destruction, halachically, there's no reach nichoach. There is no smelling. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't figuratively smell the sweet smell of the sacrifices. And when God smelled the sweet smell of the sacrifices of Noach, he said the destruction of the temple being the world that was created, that God should have a residence together with man. So the destruction is over. I could smell the sweet smell of Noach's sacrifices, of the Reach HaNikoach. And Yitzchak, wherever he went, that was also a temple. Yitzchak didn't leave Eretz Yisrael, but wherever he went, that was the temple. And because wherever he went, that was the temple. Temple represents the special closeness a person has to God. The place that he felt closest was in nature. Closest to God was in nature. There was no disturbances from other people. It was nature itself. Because of that, Yitzchak with Vayetzi Yitzchak l'suach b'sadeh. Yitzchak went in the field. So Yitzchak, when he looked at godliness, he saw godliness in nature itself. Now, however, the Avadim, the slaves, what did they see? According to one medrash, they saw nothing. Okay, so why didn't they see the mountain? So we could say that they saw the mountain, but the mountain did not appear special to them. It was just a mountain. They couldn't see the Anan Kosher Aleha. But the Medrash says that they saw a desert. The Medrash, not the way it's recorded in the Das Kenu Balatosas, but the way it's quoted in the Medrash Tanchuma. They saw a desert. So the question is, if they saw a desert, how is it that Yitzchak saw a Har Noah, a beautiful mountain? And we could say, but I think it's more than that, we could say that what made it a Har Noah, what made it beautiful in Yitzchak's eyes, was the fact that he saw the Anan Kosher Aleha, the fact that he saw the heavenly cloud over it. But the servants, They didn't see the heavenly cloud. They didn't have that spiritual vision. So that mountain was not any special than the other areas that were around there. And perhaps the areas around there were all desert. Because of that, they said, all we see is desert, according to the Medrash. But I think it's more than that. Now, I mentioned before that the Medrash mentions this whole episode about God saying, the God, that Avraham saying, I see seeing a heavenly cloud on the mountain, and Yiztchak saying, I see a heavenly cloud on the beautiful mountain. And the servants, the slaves, they didn't see anything, or they saw a desert, whatever it is. And then the Das Kenim Baal Tosfos says that's why the halacha is that in regard to servants, in regard to slaves, it's identified with the recognition of the facts that a slave does not have regular family life, that a slave doesn't have pedigree. And the question is, what's the connection between these incidents? And I think what's interesting is when you take a look at the Torah, the Torah says that on the third day, Vayeira hamakom merachok, Avraham saw the place from afar. And the Medrash says he saw an unkosher, a heavenly cloud. But we can understand the Medrash because the word makom, which is place, in Medrash is also used as a terminology, Medrash and Gemara. It's a terminology that's used in regard to God. Hu mekomo shalom. He is the place of the world. Now, so the Medrash uses the explanation, Vayeira hamakom merachok. He saw the heavenly cloud, he saw spirituality, he saw God from afar. Now, according to some Midrashim, one of the servants that went with Avraham was Eliezer. Eliezer was a special person. Chazal say that he had Fitzas Haderech. When he was sent by Avraham to get a wife for Yiztchak, all kinds of miracles took place through him. And he scanned Beso, and at one point, Avraham was even thinking that Eliezer would be his successor. And Avraham let everything in the house be run on the basis, on the direction of Eliezer. So how is it that Eliezer couldn't see anything? That he didn't have that spiritual vision? And the truth is, when you take a look at next week's Sedra, Avraham sends Eliezer to seek a wife for Yiztchak. And the Medrash tells us that Eliezer, of course, he followed the directions he was given with Avraham, but there was a certain sense of disappointment because Eliezer felt that his daughter might have been a proper wife for Yitzhak. After all, she was born and she was brought up in the house of Avraham Avinu, in the camp of Avraham Avinu. And where was Rivka brought up? In the house of idolatry. Okay, obviously, as my uncle said, there were some outside influences Avraham left, according to my uncle, a religious underground, and who helped inspire Rivka. But still, Rivka was not brought up in a house of dedication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Eliezer, how is it that HaKadosh Baruch that Eliezer's daughter was rejected outright by Avraham? And the Medrash says that Avraham told Eliezer, "You're Oror, you're cursed," because Eliezer was from Canaan, he was from Cham. He was cursed. And my son is Baruch, and my son is blessed. And the curse can't attach itself to blessing. And we have to understand, what does that mean? What does that mean? I think what it is that Eliezer was a very religious figure. He was in such a high madrega, a high level of spirituality. But he was in a high level of spirituality when the spirituality was right in front of him, when God was right in front with him. But from afar, Eliezer couldn't see spirituality. That was the uniqueness of Avraham and Yiztchak, that they were able to see spirituality from afar. And Eliezer's daughter, so long as she was in the house of Avraham Avinu, so she was devoted to God. But she didn't have a sense of the future. And to be a mother of the Jewish people, you have to have a sense for the future. When Esau sold his Bechorah, he sold his birthright. He said, Anochi holech lamos v'lama li Bechorah. I'm going to die. What do I need the birthright? The fruits of the birthright are all in the future. The nation of Avraham, they will be enslaved first, and then they'll establish their nation. I want to establish my nation now when I'm alive. Esau did not have a sense for the future. And consequently, he couldn't become an Ab of Klal Yisrael, a leader of the descendants of Avraham, of the nation of Avraham. And a slave does not have a sense for a future either. A slave doesn't have a sense for a past, and he doesn't have a sense for a future. He only has that one moment because he can be sold away from his parents, and most of the time they were sold away from their parents. And their children are sold away from them, traded on the market. So the servile perspective, even in the cases where they didn't have those situations, but that was the servile perspective. There was only the moment. There wasn't Meirachok. Eliezer didn't have a sense for the future. He only had a sense for the present. Eliezer's daughter only had a sense for the present. And what happened to the souls of the Jews, of the Nefesh Asher Asu B'Charan? When Avraham went to Eretz Canaan, he went with many people. But the Nefesh Asher Asu B'Charan, what happened to them? The Nefesh Asher Asu B'Charan, they went to who were the Nefesh Asher Asu B'Charan? So the Mepharshim give two explanations. One pshat was, the simple pshat is, it was the servants of Avraham. And the other explanation is, the nefesh asherasu b'charan were those that Avraham was Megayer, those that he brought close to the Shekhinah, those that he educated about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, about God. Now, my uncle suggests, I saw in some of the notes, but the nefesh asherasu b'charan left Avraham before he reached Eretz Canaan. I don't know that we have to say that, but one thing is for sure, even though they stayed with Avraham, but their generations did not stay with Avraham. I saw at one time, I mentioned this before, that archaeologists went into the lower floor of the Maras Machpelah, and they found bones, human skeletons, many human skeletons on the bottom. Obviously, that's Chas v'Shalom, that wasn't the Avos and the Emos, they were buried somewhere in there. But just lying on the floor of the bottom floor of the Gemaras Machpelah is a double floor. It dawned on me, whose bones are these? And the archaeologists, they tested it scientifically. And it dates back to the time of the Avos. I'm wondering if those weren't the bones of the Nefesh Asherasu B'charan, of the servants of Avraham and Yiztchak, that in a sense were buried in a different sort of way in the Maras Machpelah, near Avraham. So, but in any case, what happened to them? The answer is, so long as they were together with Avraham. So it was a nefesh asherasu b'charan. It was so long as they were together with Avraham. So they were devoted to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the future generations did not stay with Avraham. Why? Because even the original generation, the generation that stayed with Avraham, the generation that might be buried, I don't know, might be buried in the Maras Machpelah together with Avraham. But they were servants of Avraham. They had a servile perspective. They only had a sense for the present. They didn't have a sense for the future, because that is the servile perspective. And I think that we could suggest that this is the reason why Avraham, it was a midbar. It could be it was a desert. But because it could be it was a desert, but the reason Avraham and Yitzchak saw an anon kosher aleha, and Yitzchak saw a har noah as a result of the anon kosher aleha. As a result of the anon kosher aleha. So the reason is because Yitzchak and Avraham, they didn't just see the mountain at that moment. They saw the mountain of the future. They saw the Beis Hamikdash. They view it not from the perspective only of the present, but it was from the perspective of the future. But the Avodim, great as Eliezer might have been, and Yishmael, even though he probably, as the Medrash says, I saw it in some of the Mefarshim maybe, I don't remember, that the other one was Yishmael, and Yishmael was a son of a maidservant. He probably did not retain the status of an Eved, but the mental perspective of an Eved he had. They had no sense of the future. And because they didn't have a sense of the future, they couldn't see things meirachok from afar. They could see God, and Yishmael did tshuva. They could see God when God was right in front of them. Similar to at Kriyas Yamsuf, the Torah tells us even about the Jewish people. Ra'asa shivcha alayam, the shivcha alayam, the maidservant at the sea, saw more revelation than Yecheskel ben Buzi, than the prophet Yecheskel ben Buzi. But what happened to the maidservant at the sea? We don't see anything happening afterwards. But Yecheskel ben Buzi, we see. Why? Because Yecheskel ben, when the Jewish people initially, when they left Egypt, they still had the servile perspective. And they only saw what was right in front of them. Am Sheyoref. What is an Am Sheyoref? That you only see what's in front of you. You can't turn your neck. You can't see what's behind you. You can't see what's in front of you. So, maidservant at the sea saw more than Yecheskel ben Buzi, but they weren't able to take it with them to the future because they didn't have a sense of future at that point. And Yiztchak and Avraham, they had a sense of the future. So it was Vayeira es hamakom merochel. And we could suggest that actually it was, in terms of linking the past, the future with the present, there Avraham and Yiztchak both had that. But with in terms of linking it with the past, Yiztchak might have been stronger than Avraham, because Avraham's name, and last week's Sedra, he gets the name Avram, and our sages tell us, Kol hakore la Avram, Avram over basei. If somebody calls Avram by his former name, so he's in violation of halacha. The poskim don't bring it down, but for whatever the reason is, the Gemara mentions it. So a person is not supposed to call Avraham Avram. But when it comes to Yaakov, so Yaakov gets the name Yisrael, but he still retains the name Yaakov. Why is it? But the answer is very simple. Because by Avram, when he undergoes Gerus, or he becomes, but it was a rejection of his past. So to a certain degree, Avram did not link past, present, and future, because Avram had to sever his past. And the name Avram represents the past. Avraham represents Avram's present and future. So Avram was strong in linking present with future. But Yiztchak was strong in linking past, present, and future, because his recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu began from the moment of his birth. And it's because that his recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu began from the moment of his birth that he was able to see God in nature. Avram, of course, he saw God in nature, but that's not where he felt closest to God, because he had initially seen nature without God. But Yitzchak, God and nature became identified, not chas v'shalom, that God was limited to nature, but he saw God in nature as well. Okay.
If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. So we have one question. You mentioned at the beginning and a little bit later on that Hashem only commanded Avram to bring Yitzchak up and not to slaughter him. what about the midrashim that say that he actually did cut Yitzchak? Should we?
And
Is there a different lesson to learn from them, or what?
I'm explaining it the way Reb Chaim explained it. That's the first thing. And I'm mentioning this medrash. There could be other medrashim. There are even some medrashim that he was burnt and all that. I don't take those medrashim literally. If somebody wants to take those medrashim literally, so there's a dispute between the medrashim, and I'm explaining the medrash that says, Lo amarti lecha shachteyu ela ha'alehu. My sense is that the other medrashim say it had the impact, like these things happen. That's the way I would understand those other medrashim.
Thank you. No other questions yet. Okay, I guess there are no other questions. So thank you for the share. Thank you everyone for being here and for changing your clocks.